Hello, this is your professor, Dr. Adam Dunstan, and today we're starting Topic 7, Civilizations, States, and Great Archaeological Discoveries. Now, I wanted to clarify that I won't always be doing these video lectures from my house, and in fact that I do actually go into the office to work. However, it's actually convenient for me to videotape here because it's where some of my videotaping hardware, as rudimentary as it is. And also, it's actually kind of applicable to the lesson that we're starting right now. Because if you look around my house, you can actually see a lot of signs of the drastic cultural changes that we're talking about this unit. So for the next few days, we're going to be talking about the shift that happened around 12,000 years ago to 5,500 years ago, when people started developing domesticated animals and plants, and eventually what we call civilization. Now, when anthropologists use the term civilization, we don't mean civilized, like as in, oh, so-and-so is so civilized because they drink wine and listen to NPR, right? No, by civilization, anthropologists mean something much more specific. It's not a value judgment about a culture. To say that a culture is civilized or is a civilization is to say that it's city-based and it's large and it has government and stratification. Now, for the vast majority of human history, archaeologists and paleoanthropologists have been able to surmise that human beings existed in small bands, very small groups of hunters and gatherers, or foragers, in which case there would have been a very high degree of social equality. There wouldn't have been much difference in wealth between people. There would have been very loose political leadership, if any at all, and generally extremely different than the kind of life that we live today. If we look around me in my house, we can see just sort of a bunch of different relics of the very different life that we live as opposed to our foraging ancestors. All because of changes that happened really not that long ago, again, 12,000 to 5,500 years ago. So let's look at a few examples, actually. For example, I'm going to go to the fridge really quick and my pantry. Hold on. So I don't know how copyright works on this, so I'm not going to refer to this cereal by name. But here I have a box of cereals, don't look at the name, that rhymes with Bunny Bunches of Oats. Anyways, my box of cereal, Bunny Bunches of Oats, is made, among other things, from wheat, right? And of course, foragers, for most of human history, were just eating plants, wild plants. But there came a point around 12,000 years ago, it is estimated, that early foragers started selectively harvesting plants so that they were getting larger and larger seed and basically transforming small little scrubby grasses into bigger and bigger and bigger types of crop, and easier and easier and easier to grow, until eventually you get things like wheat and corn and rice, which drastically changed society. The other things I took out of the fridge were this, a gallon of milk, and a gallon of milk comes, of course, from a cow. And cows are a very interesting creature because, of course, you can imagine that what we have now as a modern cow is not exactly evolutionarily a good fit for life in the wild, right? They're extremely slow-moving, not overly intelligent, and very docile. But contrast that with the ancestors of the modern cow. The ancestors of the modern cow were called aurochs, and they looked significantly different. Among other things, they were more muscular, leaner, and more aggressive. Now, aurochs were great for surviving in the wild, but what they weren't great for was for humans to get milk. You can imagine, an early forager maybe trying to get milk off an auroch and the auroch goring him to death. But instead, over time, humans were able to domesticate aurochs, breed them to be more and more and more docile. Eventually, you get the modern cow, and because of that, we're able to have things like gallons of milk. We're also being able to have things like a block of cheese. Now, I know no one would have like a block of cheese with their milk and cereal, but it's just to prove the point that if you go to your pantry or you go to your fridge, you have all these different foodstuffs that are the direct result of the fact that back in the day, foragers were able to slowly domesticate plants and animals. And, eventually one of the things that allows is that they're able to make farming extremely more and more and more productive, to the point that you get to what we have now in the United States, where less than 5% of the population is actually involved in our food production and are able to produce enough food essentially for the other 95% of people, so that we can do things like, be an anthropology professor or a speech pathologist or a journalist, because somebody else is growing our food for us. So as you can see, my fridge full of food is actually a really good sign of some of the changes that happened a few thousand years ago. You might have heard a second ago my baby crying just a little bit, and don't worry, his mother's attending to him, but that's another kind of good little symbolic thing of the changes that happened, because one of the things that happened once plants and animals were domesticated is that human population growth really went really fastly increased, really rapidly increased. And it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing depending on which archaeologist's theory we're buying into. Some say that population growth was happening, requiring human beings to start domesticating and growing more food. Other people say that the domestication allowed for more population surplus. Either way, we see a strong correlation between once plants and animals were domesticated, human populations growing rapidly on this planet. And so as a bit of a contrast, hunter-gathering societies, foraging societies, tend to have low population densities. An extreme example of this is the Aboriginal Australians, where in certain desert parts of Aboriginal Australia, you would have 0.01 people per square kilometers. That was the population density. Compare that to Denton. Denton has approximately 10,000 times that population density, at least in the neighborhood that I live in. By the way, you just heard a siren from a police officer, and a police officer is generally part of enforcing laws from a government, which brings up another major change that happened with domestication. A few thousand years after domestication, we started to see the rise of city-based societies, what we call civilization, and specifically city-based societies with governments. Among other things, as populations increase, there develops governments as means of socially controlling the population, because you can imagine that it's very easy for a small band of foragers to get along pretty well together without a formal police force, especially if everybody's related to each other. But as things get progressively larger and suddenly you have hundreds or thousands of people living on top of each other in a city, social order starts to break down. People start to be interacting with strangers a lot more, and you're a lot more likely to steal from a stranger or even be violent against a stranger. And so that's one of the reasons that we start to see the development of formal laws and police forces. The other reason, most likely, is that we start to see wealth inequalities with the rise of cities. And so that's probably another reason that there had to be now these police forces. The third thing is we now have full-time politicians, and that's partly facilitated by domestication, in the sense that once more and more food is being produced, you can now have people that aren't growing the food full-time and instead are taking taxation and tribute from the people, and instead being a full-time politician or a full-time law enforcement. So, and that's not a direct thing that happened right at the same time. It's not as if domestication happened and then overnight they had cities with formal government and formal police forces, but the domestication allowed for this to eventually arise. Which leads to the condition we have now. Also in my home, we have a bunch of Harper's magazines, which is one of my favorite magazines to read. And as we're reading along the headlines here, we see things like talking about the British monarchy, the Communist Party, Donald Trump and his misfits, a piece by Ralph Nader, basically a bunch of stuff that has to do with politics. And the point I want to make there is that magazine articles like these would have made no sense to our foraging ancestors, right? Because power was very diffuse among the band. For the most part, they didn't have formal politicians. They maybe had one person that was sort of the leader. But for the most part, again, power was pretty diffuse, or maybe it was held sort of loosely by some elders. Contrast that with the situation we're in now, where we have a formal government with a sprawling bureaucracy of thousands upon thousands of people and a budget in the billions of dollars, with a standing military, a standing police force, the ability to tax us, and in fact to garnish our paychecks if we don't pay our taxes. In other words, we are completely different from our ancestors, again, partly because of those changes that happened a few thousand years ago, and that's one of the reasons that you and I are obsessed with what's going on in the presidential primary, is because we're essentially debating who gets to be in the charge of this incredibly powerful apparatus called a government, which humans actually haven't even had that long. The other thing I wanted to mention was you might hear cars going by in the background. And that's again a sign of the fact that I live in a city. Now, Denton's not the biggest city in the world. It's even much smaller than Dallas. But compared to what hunter-gatherers and foragers were living in, completely different. The idea of thousands of people living on top of each other would have been entirely foreign. The fact that I have hundreds of people that I don't even know within a square mile of me. Very, very different. And the final thing I wanted to note in my house was my clothes. And so you'll note with my clothes an important fact, which is that I'm an anthropology professor, and shockingly, I don't know how to make my own clothes. In fact, I have to go to a store like Kohl's or something like that and buy my clothes. And in fact, if we look at my tie, where'd that thing go? Oh, there. Here it is. There's a little tag. Might be hard to see the tag, but basically what it says first off is that this is 85% silk and 15% polyester. I have a vague idea of where silk comes from and an even more vague idea of where polyester comes from. I clearly do not know how to make my own clothing. I'm only able to get clothing because I go to a marketplace where I trade these pieces of paper, which we call money, or a plastic card that we say has money on it, trade that for clothes that were made by somebody else. And I was able to get that money because I do a very specialized form of teaching that I get paid for by the state of Texas. Now, why I just told you all that is to bring up the idea of economic specialization. With the rise of cities, we also see the rise of markets and very specialized industries where, suddenly a farmer is making more food than they need, so some other person can start building pots, let's say. And then they say, hey, let's make a deal. I'll make the pots, you make the food, and let's trade it with each other, right? And we start to see the rise of markets, trading, job specialization. Taken to its logical extreme, you have what we have today, where people have jobs that are so incredibly specialized that I don't even know how to provide my basic necessities. I'm only able to obtain them through trade. The final thing I wanted to mention was that this little tag also says made in China. And so this wasn't even made by somebody in my community. It was made by somebody a world away, right? And I don't even know the ethical conditions under which this piece of clothing was made, unfortunately, or anything particularly about the person that made it. It was something I obtained at a store not knowing where it was from even. The point I want to make with that is that eventually markets grow and grow and grow, societies grow. Eventually we get the changes that come with globalization, and you get a system where we have global markets and people trading goods all over the world. All of this is just some of the examples that we can see looking in a American anthropology professor's house of the drastic cultural changes from our foraging ancestors to where we are now. And so these archaeological finds that we're talking about this chapter, they're not just sort of, oh, that's interesting, or oh, that's cool, but actually have dramatic effects on the kind of lives that we live today.